Alrighty, welcome back. Hello. Hello, Manny, Moda. Okay, great. All right, so we're closing in on a great end of a great day here. We have this panel and then a nice keynote to wrap it up. This is really always one of my very, very favorite conferences of the year because it really, I think, combines and it integrates in a really unusual way science, technology, medicine, and humanism, and I think it all reflects the qualities, as I noted on Twitter, of the visionary organizer, this Zach Kohaney. So maybe we could just give a little recognition. I think it is a very unusual conference. So I get the somewhat intimidating privilege of introducing this incredible panel, and I just want to set the stage. So this is, I think, what Greg Simon called the whiz-bang part of the day, where we understand why we need to make progress, the patients who desperately need improved treatments, improved therapies, and then there's this idea that there's all of this incredible technology, all of this incredible data that's reinvented or enabled us to reinvent almost every aspect of life, from banking, how we travel, how we do almost everything. And then the question is, why can't we take some of this and apply it to medicine? What's taking so long? And I think what's critical to understand in all of this is that, and what's going to be the theme of this panel, is the distinction between invention and implementation. And so on the left here is the first gas-powered car invented by Benz in Germany in the late 1800s. And obviously on the right is what someone called, I guess, the Palo Alto Volvo. That's a Tool Buttes joke, by the way. But on the other hand, but if you say, okay, to go from, to get that, that's not the only difference. This is what roads looked like in Germany at around this time. And so, in other words, in order to actually be able to get to the point of the modern car, there's a lot of infrastructure, a lot of underlying aspects that you need. You need cars, you need gas stations, you need to be able to do all the things that are necessary to actually get the brilliance of the idea and actually figure out how to turn it into practice. This is actually the theme of a great book by James Besson, who's now in the Boston area, called Learning by Doing. And he highlights in his book the distinction between invention and implementation and talks about how much of the productivity gains that you get from something isn't just the moment it bursts onto the scene like Athena from Zeus's head, but it's actually the hard work of figuring out how do you actually, this sounds like a cool idea, but how do you actually use it? And how do you actually turn this promising idea into something that's actionable? And the last slide is and what we're going to hopefully hear from these experts, some thoughts on how to actually go about doing this. And just to keep in mind, say, well, why bother? Who cares? And so this is Sidney Brenner, one of the sort of the great geneticists, and then this sort of famous quote. He said, "Progress in science depends on new techniques, discoveries, and ideas, probably in that order." And the basic point is that technologies really can be just profoundly enabling. They can allow us to do things we couldn't do before, to see the world in new ways, to engage with patients, to engage with the world in a radically new fashion. But we still are wrestling with how to actually do this. And so to share some thoughts on how to do that, we have this tremendous panel who are each going to, I think, give a little bit of a self-introduction, and then we'll have a discussion. So the first speaker is Andrew Beam from DBMI at Harvard.
So I'd like to thank Zach for inviting me to be part of this panel. As I mentioned, I'm a computer scientist, junior faculty in the Department of Biomedical Informatics here. As we were talking before, I realized that I'm the only non-MD on this panel, and I've warned my fellow panelists that if backed into a corner, I will start talking about math, so they can't say that they haven't been warned. So I realized also, too, as I was thinking about this last night, that I thought the panel was about artificial intelligence, and I guess that's a little narcissistic on my part because that's my research agenda. But based on the questions this morning, I think that there's actually a lot of interest around artificial intelligence in medicine as one type of technology that may empower precision medicine. So I thought I would use my time to state some facts that are obvious to people like me and Zach that may be non-obvious about artificial intelligence to everyone else. The first of which is that AI has sort of a really long history of overpromising, especially in medicine, to help patients. That you can go back to the 70s and read papers sort of about okay, so we have the slides now. Great. So you can go back to the 70s and read papers about how the computer is going to automate much of the intellectual work of a physician, that AI is going to revolutionize patient care, and here we are in 2018 and it still hasn't happened. So the facts I would like to give you is a short argument about why things are different now and why I think AI is actually going to make a change in the near future and why you should be excited about that. I'm going to lay out a few facts to frame the discussion for the panel and then turn it over to the next speaker. So the first thing is that things are different on several axes for artificial intelligence now in medicine. Historically, AI has been very bad at doing things that doctors do. So in the past 5 years or so, specifically within diagnostic medical imaging, we have computer programs that can read an X-ray or a pathology slide at or above that of a human physician. These studies have been published in the top medical journals, have been validated extensively, and so the skill set is in place for computers to do some subset of what doctors do. The other thing that has changed in the last 5 years is support from the regulatory agencies. So historically, these have been treated as medical devices, and if you were going to get them implemented in a clinic, you sort of had to think creatively about how to go around the hospital. Our new FDA Commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, has publicly said that he's very, very bullish on AI and is willing to embrace it. So this has drastically lowered the barrier for entry for these technologies. So when you put 2 and 3 together, the fact that these things actually work and we have regulatory support makes me think that in a 5-year time horizon, we're going to see these things come about in clinical practice and actually start to touch patients. Based on my conversation with the panelists before, I'm going to acknowledge that this is a point estimate with a very wide confidence interval. So Shaywitz mentioned that the road to implementation is long and that the last mile can sometimes be infinitely long. So I think a 5-year time horizon is reasonable, with the acknowledgement that there's a lot of uncertainty around that estimate. So just to give you a flavor of what the FDA has approved, they've approved the screening for diabetic retinopathy. Notably, this AI device does not need the oversight of a physician. It can be done by a technician. So you can get a diagnosis for diabetic retinopathy and never have seen an actual doctor. Detecting fractures from X-rays and then detecting strokes. So there are real approvals for actual FDA AI systems in place now, and I think that all this means is that the long history of wanting to improve AI in medicine is here, and if Ron Paul were here, he would probably let you know that it's actually happening. We should be excited about it. Thanks.
All right, that's fantastic. I mean, I think it's also one of the real themes that we're perhaps seeing emerge is the extent to which regulators are increasingly seen not so much as part of the problem, but at least have an opportunity to be part of the solution. And it currently not both Scott Gottlieb, but also Sean Cozen, who's been incredibly forward-thinking, and a lot of the work that enabled this by Donna Woodcock, who spoke at this conference a few years ago, and Taha Kashut, who's developed a lot of the technology as well. So I'm really excited to invite, I think probably our first of several HMS graduates, to speak, who's over the course of years built this incredibly well-regarded company, now called, right, Inovalon, Keith Dunleavy.
Echoing Andy, thanks Zach for the invitation. I never sat physically in this building, but just across the street. I lived right across the alleyway here in the building that all med students start out at, as did my wife, that we both met here, and then we ended up couples matching down at Hopkins. And while at Hopkins, I started to be amazed. Actually, it was computer science, electrical engineering, and cognitive neurosciences in undergrad, and was amazed when I got to residency how little the computer was used in healthcare. And ultimately, during residency, started what became the predecessor companies of what is now Inovalon, several thousand employees. And I'll tell you a little bit about it just to frame the context of what we'll be talking about. So Inovalon is a company entirely focused on how data should drive healthcare, how data can improve the clinical and quality outcomes of healthcare and the economics of healthcare. And we do this in a way that allows for what we call vertical integration all the way from the major macro players, the health plans, the pharmaceutical companies, the diagnostic companies, and so forth, device manufacturers, all the way down to the point of care. One of the things we believe very strongly in is the incentivization to drive major infrastructural and behavioral changes in any industry is necessary. And we'll talk a little bit about how that has been happening in healthcare. And those major economic forces drive the desire to make major investments, and major investments ultimately drive typically behavior changes, or a little bit of vice versa. So we have been connecting the healthcare ecosystem in this vertical integrated fashion to bring the ability to have data at the fingertips of the physicians, knowingly or unknowingly, to drive how care is practiced and drive it in a more economically and more outcomes-focused way. So we operate all around the United States. We serve now thousands and thousands of clients, hundreds of health plans, healthcare organizations, 132 pharmaceutical companies, every major healthcare system you could probably think of. Most hospitals in the country, knowingly or unknowingly, are connected into our system. We have about 243 million patients in the system, about 980,000 physicians. We have about 38 billion medical events, and we're connected live into about 50,000 provider sites. And what this allows us to do is allow for the insights that can be driven from data to truly impact how healthcare is practiced. And very often this is behind the scenes. Perhaps during the Q&A session, I'll tell you a funny evidence of how much physicians hate to be told what to do by a computer. What makes us different? There's a lot of companies out there that do work in data and analytics, and how do we go about it that's different than other organizations. And if you go to any of these major conferences like HIMSS and so forth, the word analytics is like sand on the beach. It occurs so often in the marketing materials. So things that are really unique about us is, first of all, the size of the data set. And what is unique about Inovalon is all of our data is primary source. So most organizations in the world that deal with data purchase their data or buy it in kind. They're trading something to get their data, and under US healthcare data laws, they get that in a de-identified fashion. So they do what's called probabilistic matching to create their databases, which is great if you're creating a holistic population analysis or publication, or if it's great if you're dictating marketing strategies for a new drug that's going to roll out, or pricing, or what have you. But if you're actually going to impact clinical care, you actually have to really know who the patient is. And you have to know that the patient 18 years ago is the same patient today, and they didn't go through marital status changes or geography changes or any other things that could make for, oh, I thought they had this disease and now they don't. So large primary source data sets, critical component. The other thing that's really important in value-based care is relative. Right? So your hospital is not good or bad, it's good or bad compared to another hospital. And in fact, the incentivization dollars and cents that are driving the whole system are purposely shifting where they put their dollars and cents, where they can have greatest impact, which, by the way, is driven a lot by analysis. So if you're going to work in value-based care, you actually have to know how you're doing compared to everyone else. So you actually have to have timely data. You can't have data from 2 or 3 years ago. Again, that's great for a publication, but it's not great for winning in this system that is increasingly value-based. Then in order to do that, you have to have giant compute, right? So you have to have very advanced analytical capabilities, and you have to have giant coverage, right? You can't go to Aetna or United or Blue Cross Blue Shield and say, I'm going to take care of all your patients where it's convenient for me. You have to say, I'll take care of all your patients. So you have to have massive connectivity and broad reach. So this is Inovalon. I believe very strongly personally that data should drive everything in healthcare. There's 180,000 ICD-10s now. There's 63,000 NDC drug codes, 130,000 CPT procedural codes. I used to think I was decently intelligent, but I can't possibly contemplate the interrelationships and considerations, all those different diagnoses, treatment modalities, and uniquenesses of a patient in 15 or 20 minutes. That you happen to maybe hopefully have with a patient. So everything in order for us to be the best physicians we possibly can and do the best for society, we need to increasingly use great tools, which we'll hopefully talk about.
Alrighty, it's my privilege now to introduce someone who was a cardiac fellow when I was intern resident. Incredibly well respected, both one of the rare folks who is just both a brilliant clinician, a tremendous scientist, and just a great human being, Calum MacRae.
David, thanks. I'd like to thank Zach for the opportunity to speak this year, and also thank David for the introduction. I am, as David said, primarily a clinician. I'm a human geneticist. I also had the privilege to lead a cardiology division and think about implementation. And now I'm fortunate enough to run two programs, one an innovation program across the Department of Medicine at the Brigham, and the second a large research program designed to really identify novel phenotypes in collaboration with Verily, the American Heart Association, and AstraZeneca. I think at the core of everything that we're talking about in precision medicine is one basic idea, that in order to be precise, you need to be comprehensive. And if you don't even know the bounds of the data sets that you're trying to explore, you know already that you're in real trouble. And medicine, I think, is essentially hamstrung completely by this portfolio of, I suppose, images that I put together to try and describe what's at the core of precision medicine. So if you think about most of what we need in order to vertically integrate, as we just heard about, it's understanding the relationships between the different data types. So most of the diseases that we commonly look after are actually interactions between environment and biology, or the fundamentals of your biology genome. And yet the genome is really the only bounded data set in all of medicine, in all of biology. It's the only place where we know the start and the finish, and almost everything else that we measure is so woefully underpowered and undersubscribed that we're off by several orders of magnitude just in terms of the types of data we collect, far less the ways that we collect them. Importantly, we also don't collect data in any form of trajectory. We collect it cross-sectionally. We collect it in ways in which it's not related to each other. Everything is siloed. Most payers only know about the drugs that people are on from inference through the billing codes. Most pharmacies only know the diagnoses through inference from the billing codes. And the patients themselves are stuck in the middle in a data architecture that really, to be honest, comes from the late 1960s. Importantly, the data we collect actually come from the late 1800s. So I had the privilege working with Stan and the Undiagnosed Diseases Program at the NIH to be asked to actually put together an estimate of what the cost might be for the entire UDN, and Zach obviously was the chair of the coordinating center. And when you add everything up, there are 9,835 billable phenotypes in North America. And everybody in the room differs by about 10 to the 6 nucleotides across their 3 times 10 to the 9 nucleotides in their genomes. So just a simple information content analysis suggests that the things we measure in medicine are off by somewhere between 5 and 7 log orders in complexity. And in fact, the sad thing is that even assumes that any of these variables are truly independent. The majority of what we collect is actually highly redundant, or worse still, semi-subjective recollection of purely subjective report. So until we fundamentally fix the data we collect and the systems that we use both to collect and integrate those data, we're really hamstringing the entire platform that is medicine. And I would argue, and in fact this diagram really illustrates it probably as profoundly as you can see, that if we don't close this loop between the 18th century, I suppose kindly speaking about it, it's legacy data, and what we really need to be measuring, and then think about how we learn in real time by delivering the insights that we already know about uniformly, turning medicine from a series of essentially procedural transactions to actual biological transactions, then we're fundamentally barking up the wrong tree. So that's the sum of what I would bring to the table, and we'll look forward to the discussion.
All right. And then also privileged to introduce Paul Varghese from Verily.
They told me they weren't going to have slides. Anyway, so what should you know about me? I work for Verily, formerly known as Google Life Sciences. It is an alphabet company, and we are focused on delivering better health care to both patients and better information tools to providers. We do this by building better tools. So you may have heard of some of the projects that we've been involved with. One is called Unduo. It's for diabetes management. And what we believe is that if we give better tools for the patient, they can make better decisions, and those things can roll up to the provider as well. So we have a lot of interest in building and making the experience for the patient as frictionless as possible. If you're a diabetic, you're going to be taking a lot of blood sticks or blood sugar measurements. Can we make that more seamless and easy? For example, make a very, very small continuous glucose monitor and then have that roll up seamlessly into the patient's experience. One of the amazing things about being in health information technology and healthcare today is about the ubiquity of technology in our lives. And all of us have very, very sophisticated sensors sitting in our phones that can collect information that can be rolled up and made more useful at the point of decision that we all have as patients and as we do as providers. And we believe at Verily this is how we sort of transform, and I don't use that word lightly, transform the patient and provider experience. So you'll be hearing a little bit about how Verily is sort of approaching this to really get very, very close to the patient's experience and empower patients, add more autonomy to their lives and providers. You should also know that I came into this through a sort of an indirect career. I always thought I'd be in the academic side of things, but I did a favor for my mentor in echocardiography that led to an inadvertent career in information technology, and that's where I really learned that the power of these tools to change outcomes. One of the things that we know is that we improve outcomes by decreasing variability. And the way we decrease variability is give people better decision-making tools. So one of the themes that you'll hear from me is how do we sort of give you more information at your point of care to make a better decision. I think another thing you'll hear from me is that being on the technology side of things, I'm going to actually counsel that we pay close attention to what didn't work. That it's often easy to say, let's look at information technology and we'll make it better. Let's be cautious. Let's judge information technology. Let's judge artificial intelligence and machine learning with the same level of rigor that we judge all other forms of tools. There's a great XKCD comic that says, there's a young man from from the IT side of things interviewing for a job, and he says he believes in the philosophy of move fast, break things. And then he lists all the jobs that he's been fired from, like air traffic controller and airline pilot and surgeon. I'm here to tell you that is a real ethos. It's the beauty and power of being on the information side of things. You can do anything. Software can do anything. There are no constraints. But I think all of us instinctively from the chuckles in the room know that we have a different standard. There's a different level of criticality in what we do at the patient provider level. And so you're going to hear me asking all of you to hold us accountable, to apply a lot more rigor in how we show up and tell you that our tools will improve your lives. Ask me difficult questions. Don't cut me any slack because I have an @google.com at my address. Don't cut any of these folks any slack because they're telling you that this is going to be new and transformative. Ask for evidence.
All righty, those are great overviews. I also think we're getting some good career advice today from earlier we learned that you should always answer your phone, and here we learned to be a mensch and do a favor for people and you'll wind up at Verily. So that's great. I also think that another real theme that I think came through in a lot of the sessions from the first panel and on through is the real role of evidence. And maybe because you come to a medical school, people are really focused on that. But where I think some of where people are really interested in is there's a lot of promise. And what I think you're hearing from so many people is it's great. We should be inspired by the promise, but then demand the data and demand evidence. Although from the second panel, we can sort of see that we should maybe titrate the exact level of evidence required based on the clinical exigencies of the situation. So first question, if you look at sort of maybe the supply chain for going from data to changing medicine, there's data collection, there's data curation organization, there's analytics, and then there's changing behavior. Which of those do each of you see as the stuck point? And maybe we'll start at this end with Paul.
I think changing behavior is going to be the hardest challenge. I think that often we come and discover that a little too late. We think that if I give a person a device, if I give them a tool that is the primary way that we're going to interact and affect change. And I'll be upfront, that's often the sexy and shiny thing, that look, I made this thing, please use it. Not to pick on any form of technology or vendor, but 50% of all Fitbits are sitting in a drawer somewhere. And that says something, that, that it's not enough to show up with the device, that we need to pay attention to how that individual might be using it and the circumstances of that person's life. And often we are insensitive to that. We don't take enough time on paying attention to that.
Are there some factors that you've seen or explored at Verily that lead to technologies to be adopted faster than average?
I think it's a concept that we always get back to, is that we need to demonstrate trust, we need to show value. My jokey thing is that I can pull out my phone and I use Google Waze all the time. Why do I use Waze? When I first started using it, I was like, well, I can go faster than this Waze is telling me. No, I couldn't. You know, all those weird right-hand and left-hand turns it was taking me on, no, it was actually reliable. And then I started to build more confidence, like, oh yeah, there really is a policeman up there. Oh yes, the traffic is going to be there. I'm going to be sitting in traffic for the next 15 minutes.
And then you learn to trust the Waze overlords.
Yeah, I have not driven into a river yet. And I think that's what we found to be very successful, is that can you make the value as transparent as possible, and then you have to show up and show that it's trustworthy, so that if you're using our diabetes management platform, because we have small factors for continuous glucose monitoring, you can see the immediate effect that your diet is having on your blood glucose profile. Okay, that's a good immediate source of feedback. Now we have to show that it's going to be helpful in managing your long-term outcomes, the things that really motivate you. So I think that was the really great insight that we had, which was really tied this closely to people's motivations.
And is it a particular challenge, again, harking back to an earlier topic of sort of short-term versus long-term, of people want sort of the instant feedback, but particularly for interventions that affect, that are prevention-related, it may take a long time to see the benefit of what you're trying to do.
I don't think anybody has an easy answer for that, but that is something we struggle with all the time, that there is this disconnect between what's happening today and what's going to happen to me 5, 10 years from now. And I don't think we've cracked that nut just with technology. I think it really gets back to tying into a patient's or a person's motivations and really trying to help them understand how this fits into that set of goals that they have.
Got it. Thank you. So Calum, again, the same question. Which of the 4 areas of where sort of the stuck point, the collection, curation, analysis, or driving behavior change?
So I think all of these are actually problems.
Yes, is the answer.
I think the fundamental real critique is that they're all separate entities in the way that we conceive of medical system. And that, as Paul just outlined, we don't give feedback loops to the individual patient that allow them to actually incent themselves to do anything that they would need or like to do. And that's partly because we have based our entire system on health as the absence of disease rather than the active maintenance of wellness. And one of the things we're working, obviously, with Verily on is how do you actually measure cardiometabolic wellness rather than disease, so that you're actually looking at those transitions and able to maintain that. But I think fundamentally the behavior aspect is very tough to change. Whenever you talk to anybody that works in behavior, they always say you basically can't change behavior after childhood unless it's fashion or music. And then the second thing that almost everybody, I think, fails to realize is that the behavior that most needs to be changed is actually physician behavior. And that is at the core of, I think, the implementation problem that you outlined at the start, David, is that even after something has been through 17, 18 years of drug development, has then been through another 3 or 4 years of clinical trials, and it reaches the guidelines after another couple of years, it's 12 to 15 years before it's implemented uniformly. And the main rate-limiting step there are providers. So until we're actually able to execute on the things that the evidence already supports in a systematic way, most of what we're measuring is actually input variation rather than biological differences.
So let me just ask a little sort of a question about that. I mean, there are clear cases where people don't, do hand washing, and clear cases where there's no reason for it. But I guess if I was Nassim Taleb or maybe Jerry Groupman, what I imagine they might push back on is say, well, on the other hand, doctors are, appropriately have a little, are not embracing or shouldn't embrace neophilia. They shouldn't, just because something is new, they shouldn't necessarily do it. They should let something, they should let something be out there for a little bit. And that also different guidelines have different degree of evidence. I mean, things are, I can't keep track. Someone was mentioning food earlier. I can't keep track of this is good to eat, no, it's bad to eat, no, it's good, no, it causes cancer, no, it protects you from cancer. And not that everything it has that level of evidence, and it's certainly not just nutrition, but it can be hard to sort of keep track of. And is there a degree where the issue is physicians are appropriately conservative, you could argue, and cautious, and they're waiting for what Paul had said, the clear evidence of value, such as the prenatal test, I'm blanking on the name, it's killing me, when folks are pregnant and they get the blood test, so they don't, to obviate the need for the amniocentesis. That was adopted like overnight. So maybe when there's a clear demonstration of value in some cases. How do you crosswalk between that?
No, I certainly wouldn't in any way diminish the need for evidence. And I think we are in both directions when it comes to evidence. Stan, I think, outlined beautifully earlier on just how tough it can be to convince the profession that something might be worth testing, even far less actually just getting on to test it and get the answer. I think the problem is actually that even once we have the evidence, we tend to resist it. There's this sense that we have an almost artisanal care. And that's what drives the provider-patient relationship oftentimes, is the concept of precision medicine, whenever you enunciate it, is one, well, isn't that what we've always done? Yes, we have always modified the evidence to the individual, but sometimes we do that to the extent where we essentially ignore the evidence. And I think what we have to do is get that balance right, and that requires a much more probabilistic assessment of everything that we do. And that doesn't diminish in any way, I think, the need for the soft skills. It actually, in fact, creates the space for those soft skills to be used in the areas where there is uncertainty. And if we spend most of our time, as most providers will tell you, actually doing the sort of rote things that you have to do in order to build even rudimentary reporting on the things that you know you have to report, because the evidence has been around for so long that it's now actually fined if you don't report it. So you can imagine the iterations of that cycle. If we spend so much time in that, we don't actually have time to do the creative diagnosis, the thoughtful discussion about prevention or end-of-life issues, all of the things that providers should be doing in addition to advocating and investigating disorders that we don't understand. So if we got out of the way in the things where there actually are rigorous approaches, then I think we just create, and we do that in a quantitative way, we create space for us to be able to do the things that you allude to, which are softening the edges of many of the uncertainties that come up.
Keith, the same basic question. Which of the four is the key stuck point as you're seeing the system?
I'm going to pile on an agreement, but at a slightly different angle. How many S&P 500 companies are CEO'd by a physician? Very few. How many of the top 10 health plans in the United States are CEO'd by a physician? None. And you can go on and on. Why is that? Is there a different way that a CEO thinks than a physician thinks? And I find it fascinating when we present analytical and technology and data-driven solutions to what I'll call a corporate structure, a classic Western corporate structure, and when we present it to a physician organization structure. And the conclusion I've come to as a physician is, and I don't know which is chicken and which is egg. I don't know if we're born this way and we gravitate towards medical school or we're taught it in medical school. I don't know the answer to that. But it's this concept of the null hypothesis, and it's this concept of above all else do no harm, and a few other things that we're told. And again, I don't know if we innately felt that way or we became taught that way. But a room of physicians will turn down an approach if it does good for 99 people but doesn't solve the answer for one, in a very anecdotal sort of null hypothesis way. How does your solution solve for the 78-year-old woman who can't get out of her house to see the physician and blah, 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 blah? And you look them in the eye and you go, it doesn't. And they go, see? And you go, I'm not sure what you just proved, but
But yes, it doesn't solve for that woman's case. How many times does a physician treat a viral infection with an antibiotic? How many times do we do head CTs and studies show that there's no findings? The number of positive findings on head CTs in patients, and it's been a little bit of time since I've read the updated numbers, but it's far less than 5%. So we as physicians are okay with dramatically poor sensitivity, specificity sort of approaches to healthcare, but yet if somebody walks in the door and says, here's an analytical solution who will solve that 83% of the time, they'll go, well, what about the other 17%? And so I'm agreeing with the behavioral change issue. So I'm going to tell a quick study that we did in New York. We took 5,000 patients in New York City, and we broke them into two groups, control and observation, or control and active arm. And with half of them, we informed the physician what were the analytical gaps in care and quality that the system was able to identify. And in the other half, we did not. We just observed. And we came back 7 months later. We watched continuously, but we came back 7 months later. And in the control arm, the number of gaps that got resolved by the physician population, and everything matched, gender, age. When we looked at, was this a good control group? It was. When we looked at the number of gaps that were resolved without informing the physician, it was 3.2% of them got resolved. When we looked at the arm where we told the physician and gave them an intervention tool set to solve for it, it was 63% of them got resolved. But the funniest thing for me was that when we then went back and said, so what'd you think, right? We asked every single physician, so what'd you think? Like, what'd you think of the system? To a T, like nearly 100% of them said it was useless, it was totally obvious. And yet, if they weren't told about it, it was a 20-to-1 incidence of resolution if it was pointed out to them versus not, but yet they all thought it was worthless. So it's a behavioral shift that has to change in healthcare, not just in the patient, which is probably the most talked about behavioral shift. And in fact, I was going to see whether or not the whole panel interpreted your question as just being the patient's behavior. But I think it's really the healthcare system at large really has to go through a massive behavioral shift.
I'm sure this is going to be a big focus of, given the Cheesecake Factory essay, what a tool is going to work on when he adds his new role. A couple of quick reactions to some of what you said. One, because I think it actually does resonate, or down to the second panel, the idea of doing no harm and I think that, or the precautionary principle, I think that sort of has to be understood because it cuts both ways, because I think actually what the current FDA has done very well in general, better than previous, and certainly, Dick Pazer's division is recognizing that sometimes doing nothing actually does cause harm, and it's just sort of the harm you cause by not doing something, by not giving people access to medicines, by being so intransigent that you're going to say we're going to be so protective that you don't afford people an opportunity. So I just think there's a subtle tension there, and then for some of the examples that you talked about with giving people antibiotics or the head CT. I mean, I guess a lot of that comes down to also the classic formulation is what's the business formulation, right? Is what's the problem to be solved? If someone comes into your office and they're stressed out about their kid, and your choice is to spend 15 minutes convincing them that they don't need an antibiotic, in which case they'll leave pissed off and leave a bad Yelp review, or you give them an antibiotic and figure it's not going to hurt them. Many cases, what do you do about that? It's not clear to me, but that's why that behavior occurs. And sort of looking at it from the patient's perspective, if someone comes in, everyone's get the head CT because they want to rule out, want legal liability in the ER. But as a parent, it's reassuring. That I remember there was one of our kids had some arm injury. When the CT came back, or whatever was X-ray, it was plain film, came back, no fracture. I was really relieved, and I was spazzing out. So I understand how parents do that.
Yeah, all these are obviously great points, and these are the realities of medicine is held to a different standard and is different than so many other sciences.
one of the things that my father growing up had a little thing on his desk. He said, it said, I make a lot of mistakes because I have to make a lot of decisions, right? It's very easy to not be accused of doing anything wrong if you don't do anything, right? So, there are really bad physicians out there, right?
Yeah,
There are really bad physicians out there, but yet we seem
I've
to
heard about
always
half are below average, right?
no, only like 2 or 3% are below average.
Technically, half are below the median, depending on the
Well played.
So, I think. The point is you asked, I think very aptly, what are we solving for? And I think another part of that question is what is the alternative, right? So as we deliver care, it's that care versus what? And I think that we need to appreciate that it's not always a new technology versus great care. Sometimes it's new technology versus bad care.
Right, absolutely. Okay, Andrew.
Since I'm going last, I'll be contrarian for the purpose of having a diversity of discussion. So obviously changing behavior is difficult. It's funny, when the question was asked, my mind went immediately to physician behavior also. So that tells you something a little bit about where I'm at. But this is an anecdote that I'm going to steal from Zach. So changing behavior is difficult, but not all behaviors are difficult to change. So Zach has this story about default dosage ordering in the EHR. The guidelines had changed. They beat the physicians over the head trying to get them to use the correct dosage, and the only way they got them to change was to change the default in the EHR, such that if they wanted to do the previous dose, they'd have to do a click to change it. So I think that leveraging the way people actually move through the world and the way they actually work is a way that you can change behaviors. But I also think that the data that we have, to the point of some of the other comments, the data curation and sort of what we call the data janitorial work deserves equal attention as being difficult to changing behaviors. For example, oftentimes it will take us 6 to 8 months only to realize a project is impossible with the data that we have. A good example of this is...
Just call us.
Right. Well, the data does not exist because the model that we want to fit, there has not been data collected for that. So from a methodological standpoint, I think that the janitorial work that we say takes up 90 to 95% of any project is usually a huge stumbling block to developing these technologies and then getting them deployed.
All right, so I want to ask one more question, and then maybe we'll take questions from the audience. And we'll go back down this way. Did you? Okay. So and I guess it's sort of appropriate because it looks like sort of Andrew and Keith had one perspective, and then maybe Paul had another. The relative value of is a key issue sort of figuring out how best to use, getting the maximum use out of the existing data, which looks like what Keith's system does and what you spend so much of your time trying to squeeze the value of, or is just that even if you were, and that's sort of a Tool Butte's point, there's so much glorious data out there, versus what a lot of people, if you look at the company in Citro that Daphne Kohler founded, if you look at a lot of other ML initiatives, their basic view is that, if to sort of borrow a Dennis Miller joke, 2 of suboptimal is suboptimal. It's not like it gets, if you have, 1 million bits of crummy data, there's still a lot of crumminess in it. This is sort of the family-friendly version of this. And so the question is the issue that that we need to make better use out of the existing data primarily, and that's where we can really pick up the value, and that's where a lot of companies do? Or is it really trying to collect new data, both at a higher quality and with richer, deeper phenotypes, as Calum talked about, and as obviously Denny and I have written about for years. But I think they're both important, and I'm just sort of wondering how you see the relative value and challenges there.
So I think that's a great point. I always bring up Daphne Kohler's company when I'm talking to people, that it's telling that the first thing they did was say, we're going to spend all this money to create the data that we need because it doesn't exist. And so there are entire classes of questions that we would like to answer with machine learning, with statistical methods, that we do not have the data that will let us answer that. So I appreciate the spirit of Atul's comment in that we should use the data that we have to do some good. But I think that there's an analog here with doctors who don't want to do anything because it could cause harm. You shouldn't have the data reach beyond what they're capable of supporting, and that since we're actually have the ability to touch real patients, we should be extremely cautious about using data for things that it was not designed to do. And that's where I think that the wisdom of creating your own data. So in short, I'm hedging and saying that I don't have a great trade-off for create your own data versus the data you have. You just have to be mindful and know what kinds of questions you can ask given the data that you have.
Calum, Keith.
Yeah, so I think it's a really great question, and I think it dives to why are you doing it? What are you trying to solve for, right? So we believe very strongly in the practical applications of data and analytics and technology in healthcare today, right? To do something today, make a difference today. So if we started with any of these systems, and there's a bunch of them out there that are what's called data curation, right, where they create optimal data sets. Those have obviously a lot of great applications, but they don't have applications in the real-time care of patients because that patient doesn't have a perfect data set. That person has whatever data set they have. So the approach that we have taken is to have the machine learn on how much data it needs. Sort of like, I'm going to date myself with this. Remember back when you used to make a mixtape, right?
Oh yeah, mixtapes.
And you'd
High
run, if
fidelity,
you were
man.
really lucky, you had the system that would run through all the different songs you wanted, and it would find the highest volume and the lowest volume, and then it would set, it would adjust the amplification on the entire tape. So machine learning and what some people call AI, but I would call them advanced versions of machine learning, one of the critical things that they need to know how to do is to know how much data they need in order to make a reliable decision. And this is one of the benefits of having 38 billion medical events and watching their courses of care. Because a lot of times you want to know when the machine should say, I don't know. Right? So in a perfect world, which we don't live in, I'd love to have a bunch of other data elements that we don't have. But wanting to make a difference in this world today, we've asked the machine to decide on when it has enough information.
Okay. Calum.
So I would hedge a little bit and just say that obviously we can't throw away most of the information we've already collected. Almost everything that we know already is based on that, albeit rather redundant data set. I would just argue that if we are going to collect new data, and if we're going to collect the data that we currently collect, we collect it at the level of individual biological transactions, so that we're actually informing ourselves not just about the population, but about that individual. And until we actually build systems that do that, almost everything that we do is still skating on the surface of what we actually need to achieve, which is allow individuals to have mechanistic insights so that we can then basically use those insights to drive their therapy.
And to that end, it's interesting. I sort of occasionally participate in this. Anna Barker has this National Biomarker Development Association, this nonprofit that's trying to figure out how do you make more reliable biomarkers. And the Harvard-trained pathologist, gosh, what's going on with my memory? Blank on her name, who's associated with it, highlights the incredible importance of rigorous data collection and saying that there's so much of the analysis that's done that because there hasn't been attention paid to exactly how the samples are collected, there's so much value that's been lost in that.
There are only two standardized data types in all of medicine. The international normalized ratio, thankfully, because that's part of its definition, and the 12-lead electrocardiogram. Every other thing that we collect in medicine varies across the world.
And then, Paul, I feel like there's been a lot you wanted to say, and I didn't quite get to, so take whatever time you need.
I'm on the side of, I think we need to do both, and I'm very aligned with what Keith says. We have to fix the problems today, but we won't get better unless we have better data. You can squeeze the tea leaves as much as you can, but if they're crude, you're not going to get a better signal. And so the only way we get better is to go out, sample more frequently, better sensors, sample more accurately. I had two comments about what Keith and Andy sort of alluded to. I'm equally tough on changing the behavior of physicians, and I'll freely admit it, I didn't know the value of systems engineering and quality improvement until I got formally trained. And I think we're missing a big opportunity here by not introducing that early on into clinical training. The notion that you get better at what you measure, and it's iterative, and to sort of understand the significance of here's a parameter how do you have trust and confidence in this? And Zach and Andy and I have talked about this. How do you better introduce this into the clinical training? And I'm going to quote Zach in one of his papers, which is that we probably shouldn't be teaching, emphasizing calculus as much. We should be emphasizing more statistics. And, but to Andy's point, the data is not enough. I took my formal quality improvement training at Intermountain Health, and they have a great line, culture each process for lunch. And they told a really nice vignette where they showed the data to a children's hospital. They had 300 adverse events a year, and that did not change physician behavior, clinical behavior. When they changed the motivation speech, it was, we have a system perfectly calibrated to hurt 300 children a year. That got people's attention because nobody there was signing up to hurt children. So it is that balance. We need to educate, but we also have to connect to the people's motivations.
Those are great points. Just one small comment that I want to get to your question to start off. You know, I think I always have a little bit of a nuanced view of you sort of, you know, you have to measure something in order to change it, because a lot of times that depends on the quality of the measurement, and then you wind up focusing perhaps less on the most important elements that need to be changed and more on the actual things that you can measure. And I have an Atlantic article on this, but there's a lot of subtlety around that. Why don't we start with your question?
Hi, this is Ali from Analytics-Led Intelligence. My question is for Verily. What devices do you currently have on the market and what are coming down the pipe? And do you have anything for continuous blood pressure monitoring? And second question for you is, how is big data and deep learning going to change everything in medicine? And when will we have a Dr. Google app on our phones that will diagnose pretty much anything?
In 2 minutes, yeah, go ahead.
So about 90% of the answers will get me in trouble with our business development team. So I can talk about some of the things that we have publicly announced.
File an 8K after this conference.
So last year we announced the release of what we call our Study Watch. It's a medical grade device that you wear on your wrist that will measure a lot of sort of the activity parameters that a patient will have, including ECG, heart rate, galvanic skill response, activity. So that's one we can talk about publicly. We have a partnership with Dexcom to make one of the world's smallest continuous glucose monitors in order to make the act of sort of measuring as frictionless as possible. Those are the only two that I can talk about publicly. But yes, I think sort of the obvious things that we want to measure, we're definitely paying attention to. So yes, it would be great if we had better, more ubiquitous ways of monitoring blood pressure. But these are, you know, what I think any good, like-minded clinician would think of or patient would think of. So that's there. What is the role of artificial intelligence and machine learning? So internally to Google, we have a joke, which is like machine learning makes everything better, which is our way of us sort of gently poking at the sort of notion that sprinkling AI and machine learning is the answer to everything. Sort of an interesting tale that I didn't know until I joined Google was that for a long time Google search was powered by rules. They did not apply machine learning or artificial intelligence until they could find a way to actually improve what rules-based approaches did. So I think that's generally how we approach this at Verily, which is artificial intelligence and machine learning has a place, but it's really just a technique. I tend to look at what is the problems that we're trying to solve, and then you find the right application on this. And so I think we're still trying to figure that out, but I tend to focus more on what is the problem and then finding the right technique.
I have a question
Sorry,
for Keith.
name and
Ned
affiliation.
Bacon, I'm a systems engineer. I have a question for Keith. We pride ourselves in this country on the power of free markets, and I think that anybody would be hard-pressed to argue that medical delivery is characterized as a free market. You have a tremendous amount of data there, and correct me if I'm mistaken, the ecosystem that you illustrated included payers, providers, pharma. What I didn't see there, and maybe it was just missing, was the patient. And as a consumer of healthcare, the information that could be provided to me and make this thing transparent so that I could judge who the best hospitals were, I could judge who the best doctors were, that would be tremendously valuable And maybe there's a huge market there for you. I don't know if your customers number in the tens of thousands and you're looking at 330 million people in the United States, but I don't know if it's not available for proprietary reasons or whatever, but was that missing in your ecosystem, the patient?
So I love your question. I wholeheartedly agree with you. To take it one further, I would argue that every major technological transformation that has occurred over the last 50 years is ultimately driven by the consumer, right? So, to hit a few really simply and quickly, when I grew up, Macy's or Sears dictated what was in style, right? You'd go and you'd buy what was on the racks if they happened to have it, and that's what you wore to school in the autumn. Now the consumer dictates what's in style because they can order absolutely anything they want, and then people can track exactly what they're ordering and then quickly produce more of that. The entire movie industry got destroyed and rewritten when you could pick whatever you want to watch on TV at night, and now we have companies like Netflix and so on and so forth. And you can go through a number of different industries, and I would argue that in every single case, financial services, entertainment, retail, and so forth, ultimately when the consumer got the ability to make a decision and put their dollars where their decisions want to be, it totally rewrote the industry. Healthcare will be the same way. So today we're at an intermediary stage in the Keith Dunleavy model of how healthcare works. Right now, health plans are serving as aggregators of the consumer, right? So the consumer doesn't yet today have all of the abilities that you speak to. A lot of it's out there. You can pick which hospital you should go to. There's a lot of ways to increasingly pick which physician. It's tough to know. A lot of consumers don't know what to do with it, and there's a lot of studies that show actually consumers will do inverse decision making. They'll purposely go to the more expensive physician. They'll go to the physician that's at the fancier hospital even when their scores are lower. I just gave a talk in New York City, so I happen off the top of my head know the rankings of the different hospitals in New York. I wouldn't dare do it to Boston, where I trained.
Everything's
it's safer if I stay away from Baltimore and Boston in naming hospitals. But in New York, at this dinner that I gave a talk at, I went through and I ranked the different hospitals, and then I personally looked into the data and found out how they had bent the rules to get their hospital higher on the list. So ultimately the consumer will drive how healthcare operates. Keep in mind, and unfortunately I received no training in med school about how the healthcare system works, but one of the biggest detractors from healthcare this year, or in today, is that health plans need to make decisions based upon a very short period of time that they have the economic responsibility for a particular patient. Turnover rates in Medicare Advantage are 12 to 22% per year, commercials 33% per year. How can I spend money on your long-term well-being if the chances of you not being a patient in my health plan are really quite low?
So Keith, that's the point. That's the point that Lisa Sunan also made earlier, and that I think Troyan objected to. Let's do 4 questions in 4 minutes, lightning round. Why don't we start?
Oh man, that means I have to do lightning round. I want to say thank you very much for discussing the data quality play. I don't hear that a lot, and as a founder in this space doing data quality from source, thanks for that. My question is around you guys all mentioned the behavior of the physicians, right? Right now, like my generation, we're coming out of, the digital native generation is coming out of residency, out of med school, out of residency, and they're now taking leadership roles in the actual practice of medicine. Do you think that will fundamentally change healthcare and the adoption of better data-driven practice of medicine?
I think it has a high potential, but it goes back to, are we training them properly? That
Right.
it just, swimming in this is not, I think, sufficient for us to be able to make better decisions. We have lots of data right now. How do we sort of frame what are problems we're solving, and how do we measure how well the solutions work? So I'm glad that people are becoming digitally, data savvy, but I think just as I had to be trained in how to understand genetics and how to evaluate a genetic test, I think we are doing everyone a disservice if we think that this will happen sort of osmotically.
Okay, I want to get to the next question. Farhad?
Yeah, great. Keith, your example of the physicians using the tool but not necessarily recognizing that they needed it or had the value, and it kind of reminded me of driving in the car with my grandparents and my grandma saying, it's right over here. And I knew where I was going, but he probably didn't, right? So, I mean, I'm reminded of that, and I'm thinking about a little bit of the dialogue going on, red versus blue state, donkey versus elephant, and the tone of it a little bit for me, talking about first do no harm. A lot of physicians, number needed to treat is also something we're taught in medical school, right? So we know that it takes about a couple dozen people treated with blood pressure meds to get one that is ultimately going to get a benefit from that really in a substantive way. And having been both on the physician side as well as now with the foundation on a funder side and on a facilitator side, it seemed to me, and I'm going to use the word googly because I learned it from a Google team who came in and worked with us at the foundation about calling out stuff if it comes across as abrasive. It didn't seem googly or kind of building of the internal trust with the physicians, right? So ultimately, the way that you presented it, I think you could sell that to Intermountain to deliver and shove down the throat of the physicians. But in terms of are the physicians going to be inspired to use this tool that's bad physician versus tool, or what about it being a tool that empowers physicians and helps every physician do their job a little bit better, a little bit easier? That tone seems like it's a subtle thing, but it could be so important to drive the adoption of such an amazingly powerful device and tool that you've built.
Can you make physician behavior change more delightful?
Yeah, so I totally agree. I call it leading the witness, right? So I'm married to a physician. Physicians don't like to be told what to do. But if you're told, first of all, a really good GUI interface, you don't even know that you are being coaxed to a particular situation. I mean, when you ask the microwave how long you should cook something for, and it has all these pre-settings, you don't think of it as the microwave telling you how to cook. A good software interface, a good way of wording feels different to a user. So we call it leading the witness. So we design the way the analytics work to make the physician feel what we call empowered, supported, to make better informed decisions, but ultimately the physician's making the decision. So there's a whole art to it that's not easy. A lot of analytics writers don't understand the human element, and there's a whole groups of people that specialize in that. So it's very important. I completely agree with you.
I would just quickly say that from a palatability point of view, leading the witness still seems slightly negative in connotation.
We don't actually put it up on the banner. We don't actually say you're being led.
Excellent point. Go ahead.
Okay, this is Yao, Dr. Yu from Tufts University.
Talk to the mic. I can't hear you.
Okay, my name is Yao Yu, and I have a dual background. I'm a periodontist who is a dental surgeon and also an informatician. So since my background is a little different, so two stats to go over. So like most of the people who have dental insurance don't go to regular cleaning. So that's like really hard to change the behavior. The second stat is like when I started looking into our data in dental field, I realized we don't have standards from the beginning. The second thing is like the numbers that you go to dentists that they have to read the numbers is usually stored in an image. And in order to extract that 200 or thousands of numbers, it takes too much time. So usually we cannot get to use that for research. And so the first question to Keith, in your database, do you have any dental information in that? The second question is very straightforward. Just like in dental field, we don't have standard and we don't have like a very straightforward classification. So is it possible to do AI in non-standardized data with very sparse data sets?
So just repeat the question in case everyone didn't hear. It sounds like dentistry suffers from many of the same problems that medicine does. Can you help?
Yeah, the benefit of dental is is economically a lot different the way it operates in the U.S. and is a lot more cash driven. So it has very different adoption rates to technology. So we do have some dental information, not as widespread as one would in a pure dental situation. 3 years ago, we started doing what's called non-structured data conversion to structured data, right? It's called natural language processing and applications of machine learning and AI to do that. And healthcare is unbelievably difficult to do this. So big companies like 3M are leaders in this stuff, but they're leaders in it from like the financial services and standard data structures, standard types of non-structured data. Physicians write by saying, Mrs. Jones is a 63-year-old woman who comes in with a family history of X, complains of Y, has been evaluated for Z, is in a workup for W, and is back here today to consider progression of the diagnosis that we're working on most recently. And when you ask a computer what the diagnosis the patient has, it comes back with really crazy stuff because it doesn't understand the subtleties of how physicians think and talk. So after evaluating the whole marketplace, we decided we had to design the system from the bottoms up, and we were able to use hundreds of millions of cases to train the system. So it does work on dental information as well, and those images you're talking about, those all can be processed by an NLP, a machine learning informed NLP platform.
So maybe that's an opportunity for a startup. As a venture person, I have to make that plug. Last question.
Hello, I'm Mahesh Mangala from UMass Medical School. I work there as data scientist. I wouldn't be in here if it's not for Tech Savvy panel. You guys made it sound super amazing when you said the AI is going to be doing miracles in 5 years, and then you were saying there is deep learning, there is super parallelizable GPU compute capacity in multi-cloud vendors and stuff. But the reality, the ground reality is that even though we have Tesla now, we are still riding the 1880s Mercedes in our own internet-less rigid environment because we have patient data. So for the policymakers to take that jump from this ground reality to what you guys are promising, it requires the policymakers be familiar with all these advances that are going on in both sides of the spectrum, and they need to understand really good so that we can make use of the tools that are available. So based on your experience, what are the recommendations you give for the policymakers to be entrusted in this technological revolution?
Well, I agree so much in what you're saying that 3 years ago we went out and bought a company that deals with policy, that deals with how healthcare systems are set up and how the regulatory world is structured, and because I think what you're getting at is critical. So it is methodically, the vast majority of studies you read, or a significant number of the studies you read of state evaluations of healthcare systems and how they should adjust their Medicaid programs and how they should suggest their payment levels and things, we're typically the ones providing the data and the analysis behind those. And I think that politicians and policymakers need to continuously be exposed to the power of the possible, and it's going to take time. And there's a lot of different influences out there. There's a lot of people that have invested a lot of money in going this direction, and you're coming along and saying, might you consider going in this direction? It's like a lot of other things in society. There are differences of opinion, and you try and back your opinion up with data and persistence. And in our area, everyone in this room, or I presume the vast majority of them, we're in healthcare. It's different, right? We're doing it for the better of the patient. We're doing it for the better of society. It's a little different than how many, to quote in Apple, do you want to sell sugar soda for the rest of your life? I mean, there are higher callings, and healthcare is one of them, but it's persistence and information.
And just in terms of the last point on the policy, to reiterate, I think what a point that Paul made, which I thought was spot on, I think basically when you can make an improvement palpable, so people can appreciate the value viscerally. You use Uber or Lyft because you don't have to, no one has to persuade you. You use it, gets you from place A to place B. And if people were able to appreciate, as people increasingly appreciate the delivered value of these emerging technologies, I think the arguments will be easier to make. Please join me in thanking this exceptional panel.
And thank you, David, for your professorial work. Do not leave. Sit down. Sit down. Hand out your cards elsewhere. I'm making a command decision, as Alexander Haig would have said, for those of you who remember. You've shown that you have such a high switching cost that I'm not going to let you leave the room. And so we're going to go straight to our closing keynote. Dr. Jerry Cox is Chief Medical Officer of a company that truly does, as we wrote, do ultra-precise precision medicine. And he has continued, remarkably, to be involved with patients directly all along. Unless he corrects me, I still believe you're on staff at Children's Hospital and still sees patients in the genetics clinic. He's also been the clinical director, the VP and clinical director at Genzyme, where he helped pioneer some of these precision medicine approaches for these rare disease populations. And so finally, he had the misery of being one of my interns, I think maybe my first intern, long ago. And I knew he was going to great places, and so when I was planning this year's meeting, I saw where he was, and I said, would you be willing to share your experience? And he graciously agreed. So, Jerry, thank you very much. What do you want?
To move the slides?
Yes, just hit this.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Zach. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. My whole life has been spent pretty much thinking about rare diseases, rare genetic diseases. As Zach mentioned, we worked together at Children's during residency training, and I went on to a fellowship in clinical genetics and was on staff at Boston Children's for about 10 years. And during that time, I saw lots and lots of patients with very different diseases, but there were always very small numbers of patients with any one given disease. And in 2000, I had the opportunity to go to Genzyme, where now I could work on developing a treatment for one of these larger patient populations. And people would say to me, well, don't you miss clinical care? Well, I still did clinical care, but I saw it really as being an opportunity not just to take care of patients, but to take care of a whole patient population, because in a sense, all these drugs that were being developed, there were no prior treatments for any of these patients. So there was a lot of responsibility that we had to bring these drugs to patients. So I really did feel responsible and formed close connections with a lot of these patient populations that we were attempting to treat. Well, I was at Genzyme for about 16 years, and then about a year and a half ago, I went to Editas Medicine, just like a lot of people in this room. I heard about all the potential, future potential about CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing, and thought, wouldn't that be a great area to get into as a clinical geneticist? There's so many more opportunities besides just replacing enzymes and lysosomes, a much broader spectrum of diseases that could be treated. But what really also attracted me was the fact that these could be long-term durable treatments. Many of the treatments that rare disease patients take require either daily administration or weekly administration of IV therapy, or even every 2 weeks for life, and that becomes a burden after a period of time. And so with genome editing, there's an opportunity to make a genetic change that would be potentially lifelong and durable for the patients, that would relieve them of the chronic burden of treatment. At Editas Medicine, we think broadly about genome editing. Certainly there's genetic diseases that we're interested in treating. These would be the Mendelian diseases. Our lead program is a form of infantile blindness called Leber congenital amaurosis that has a common mutation, a particular gene that we can remove, and we believe would provide visual improvement to this group of patients. We're also interested in developing treatments for sickle cell disease, not by correcting the actual sickle cell mutation, but by upregulating fetal hemoglobin that would compensate for the abnormal sickled globin. But there's other diseases you can think of as well that don't necessarily have a Mendelian basis, but could be approached through a genomic solution. An example of this would be in the immuno-oncology field, CAR T therapies. They've shown great success initially. We believe that there's other types of genomic edits that could be made, for example, with checkpoint inhibitors or tumor microenvironment receptors that could enhance what is already a very promising therapy. And we believe there's opportunities to edit other types of cells in the immune system to treat immune-mediated diseases. But what I really wanted to focus on in my talk today was the patients, and how with working in the rare disease field, there are very common themes that drug developers encounter where patients and patient advocacy groups can really help us with our mission and their mission as well to bring these new class of precision medicines to patients. These are my disclosures. So precision medicine and personalized medicine. When I think of precision medicine, I really think of individualized patient treatment. I think of the therapeutic modality, the what, based on the underlying knowledge about the molecular basis or cellular basis of the disease. And this could be a small molecule, a protein, RNA, DNA, cell therapy. When I think of personalized medicine, I think of the how. It's not just creating a precision medicine, but how is it going to be delivered to the right patient at the right time, at the right stage of disease. And it means overcoming some barriers to access to treatment. There may be, especially for durable treatments like genome editing or gene therapy, perceptions that patients have that restrict their access to participate in clinical trials. There's also potential delays in diagnosis that prevent them from getting access to treatment in a timely manner. And then all these rare disease treatments are expensive. There's just no way around it. And reimbursement for some patients can be an issue as well. And so dealing with those matters, we really need to find a way to make sure that patients who need and can benefit from these drugs have access to them. And that's where I think patient advocacy groups have played a really important role and can continue to play an important role. Many of the older support groups were really founded to provide emotional support to families and educate each other about the disease. But there are a couple of big trends that happened over the last 20 years. One is that there were many technological advances that were made in the field of medicine, not the least of which was recombinant DNA technology. And certainly being a physician and clinic and making diagnosis after diagnosis of genetic diseases, usually the first statement out of the family's mouths was, okay, so what's the treatment? And I have to say there is no treatment. Many of these patients have very rare diseases that are not either going to be amenable to treatment or pharmaceutical companies would not find to be common enough to develop a treatment. Another big trend that occurred was the internet. And especially for rare diseases where in many places, someone may be the only one in their town or city that has that particular disease. It can be very socially isolating. And everyone is an individual. The voices are all individual and very small. But the internet allowed people to connect together for the first time. And with that came strength in numbers. And the questions that I used to get in clinic about, why can't we have a treatment? Why isn't anyone developing a treatment for us? Then it became, why not us? And patients became empowered. And, they would say, what, should we do? And I'd say, well, you should try to find researchers that are working on this. And if you know other people that have the same condition, you should get together and be a stronger voice and consider forming a patient foundation. And so, I think these foundations, they went from providing really emotional support. Now they operate like small businesses. They have vision and mission statements. They have budgets. They have coordinated fundraising. They have strategic initiatives. They have plans to translate what is in the laboratory to their constituents. I want to give you two personal examples of groups that I had the pleasure of working with that really represent opposite ends of the spectrum. Barth Syndrome Foundation, whose constituents probably number about 200 around the world. It's an incredibly rare condition. And the Foundation Fighting Blindness, whose constituents have inherited retinal degeneration, and that could number in the millions of patients in the US. So the Barth Syndrome Foundation started in 2000. That's when the first meeting was held. But in the late 90s, there were several mothers of affected boys that had Barth syndrome who found each other on the internet and said, we need to do something for our sons that have this disease. We need to understand it better. We need to find a treatment. And so this is a condition it's an excellent condition that affects only boys. During the 80s and 90s, it was considered uniformly fatal by age 3, involved infantile onset cardiomyopathy, skeletal myopathy, neutropenia, and growth retardation. And boys typically died either of heart failure or overwhelming sepsis. And reason for that was not that we didn't have drugs that could treat heart failure or take care of bacterial infections, but because the symptoms weren't recognized as being due to Barth syndrome, patients often went undiagnosed until it was too late. So in 2000, the first Barth Syndrome Foundation meeting was convened down at Kennedy Krieger Institute, and I had the good fortune of attending that meeting because I was one of the few physicians in the country that actually had patients. I had 2 patients that I had diagnosed at Boston Children's Hospital. And it was the first meeting I'd been to that had both patients as well as physicians and researchers. And we had an opportunity to examine the patients in the clinic and learn about their disease. The parents had an opportunity to hear from the physicians about the experience that we had with trying different drugs for heart failure or things like GCSF to prevent sepsis. And from that meeting, the Barth Syndrome was incorporated as a 501c3, which is a charitable nonprofit foundation. It developed a mission statement, developed coordinated fundraising efforts. The underlying genetic defect is due to a mutation in the tafazin gene, which had been identified in the 1990s, but no one really knew what it did. And through the coordinated research efforts of the Barth Syndrome Foundation, it turned out that tafazin was an enzyme that was located in mitochondria and that was involved in cardiolipin remodeling. And in fact, that would be consistent with what's been seen histologically and in autopsy samples of mitochondrial abnormalities in these patients. And so, gaining an understanding of what causes the disease then allows you more insight into how to fix it. And I'm happy to say when I just looked at the website recently, there are 2 clinical trials that are ongoing right now for Barth syndrome, which is pretty amazing considering it only affects about 200 boys in the world. Now, Barth Syndrome Foundation has been very efficient at also financing their operation. They raise about $1 million per year, and about $750,000 of that goes to research efforts every year. They have decided to really focus on pilot grants that ultimately would result in larger funding from NIH, and they have had a couple of investigators, including Bill Pooh at Children's Hospital, who has gotten an NIH R01 grant as a result of the funding from the BSF on the initial pilot study. The other foundation was started in the early 70s. It was called the American Retinitis Pigmentosa Foundation, later changed its name to Foundation Fighting Blindness. It was started by a Cleveland financier named Gordon Gund, who himself has retinitis pigmentosa and went blind as a young adult. And this organization spans really broad reaches. I had the good fortune to attend their biannual patient conference last week called Visions, and I gave a talk there about emerging technologies. And just to hear about the impact that this one organization has had in the field, they have raised over $700 million since their inception. And every year they raise about $20 to $30 million, and that money has gone to understanding disease genes that cause retinal degeneration. There's over 250 that in some way have been supported through the organization. They've launched 20 clinical trials, including the first clinical trial for the drug that became Luxturna, which is to treat RPE65 related retinal degeneration. And that was the first gene therapy approved in vivo last December. They also provide early career awards to retinal physicians, and we heard several testimonials from people attending the meeting how they wouldn't be where they were today unless they had the funding from the foundation. Now, kind of a recent trend they've had is, again, to translate research into treatments, they've actually started investing in startup companies. So again, it really is like a sustainable business where the investments that they make in these startups are designed to help accelerate treatments coming into the clinic. So when you work in rare disease companies, you form very tight bonds with the patient populations that you treat. And certainly at Genzyme, there was a very patient-centric culture. I remember going into work every day at Genzyme Center, and there would be these 10-foot high pictures of patients hanging up in the lobby that would just have their first name and their disease. And they would stare at me every day on the way into work, and they'd stare at me every day when I would leave. And it just reminded us of the mission that we all had there. There's a couple of particular departments at most rare disease companies that focus on patients. One is the patient advocacy groups, and these are really the liaisons with the external patient advocacy groups. They help bring humanity to the diseases that we're seeking to treat and the drugs that we're looking to develop. Oftentimes we'd have patients that would come visit. They'd give a lunch and learn, tell us about their disease, and it was very motivating and very inspirational to the people working in these disease areas. The other group was, or is, patient case managers. As I mentioned earlier, with these small patient populations, these treatments are very expensive, and to navigate the insurance and the co-pays and how to get access to the treatment, if it's hospital-based or clinic-based, can be very difficult for patients. And so a lot of the companies have developed these patient case managers that act as resources to help people navigate the insurance environment. So one area where patient groups can be really helpful is respect to diagnosis. And when we talk about precision medicines, it means that you have some kind of understanding of the disease, right? And so having an accurate diagnosis that will allow someone to receive a precision medicine is really important. Now, there's a couple of barriers to diagnosis. As we heard earlier, with a lot of these rare diseases, patients can go for 5 to 10 years with troubling symptoms and going from doctor to doctor, but not have a unifying diagnosis. And when you think about how do you try to improve that, certainly you can do education of primary care or specialists, but again, it can be very difficult when you have a disease that's 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million for people to even think of that condition. So a couple of the diseases that had treatments that have been developed One was mucopolysaccharidosis type 1, and the other is Pompe disease. Both can occur and have onset of symptoms early in infancy, and certainly earlier treatment is better for patients. And so with the leadership really of the patient advocates for both of these organizations, newborn screening was nominated for each of these conditions. Genzyme had been working on newborn screening for enzyme assays that could be done on dried filter paper spots, blood spots, the same newborn screening that all babies get in the US. And so as the patient advocates, along with experts in the field, that proposed these two diseases to be added onto the newborn screening panel, they went before a national committee. It was reviewed over a 9-month period, and both ultimately made it onto the way of being recommended for newborn screening. Now, newborn screening is not a federal mandate, it's a state mandate, and so states can decide which diseases they want to screen for. And right now, after about 2 years of implementation, more than half the infants in the US that are born are being screened for Pompe and MPS 1. And next year will be the first data coming out about the outcomes of that screening approach. Another barrier to diagnosis is genetic testing. I'm a geneticist. Most patients who come to the genetics clinic will get a genetic test, or at least recommendation for a genetic test. We have to oftentimes get prior authorization from insurance companies to do the testing. We find having an accurate result would be very helpful for patients. It would really define what their diagnosis is. We could sometimes prognosticate based on the gene and the type of mutation. It would give us an idea of the inheritance in the family, what the potential recurrence risk is. But a lot of insurance companies to this day still deny genetic testing. And without a genetic test, if someone has retinal degeneration, you don't know which of the 250 genes or more it may be. And so this is another area where patient groups have really stepped forward, and they've made genetic testing available to patients free of charge. In some cases, underwritten by philanthropy, other cases underwritten by companies that produce products for those particular diseases. An example would be the Foundation Fighting Blindness. I mentioned they supported research that led to the identification of more than 250 retinal disease genes. There are now these large gene panels that contain 280 genes that within a period of about a month, a patient might find out which gene and which mutation is causing their disease. And the Foundation Fighting Blindness has instituted a program where they'll offer free genetic testing to patients as long as they enter their data into the Foundation Fighting Blindness patient registry called My Retina Tracker. The reason for that is that they do understand the value of precision medicine, and that a lot of these diseases will be treated on a gene-by-gene basis. And without knowing what your underlying genetic problem is, it'll be difficult to really translate those medicines into treatments. And so the My Retina Tracker is one way that at least the Foundation Fighting Blindness has tried to get patients ready for clinical trials should they arise and they be eligible. It also serves a purpose if companies are looking to develop a treatment for one of these rare diseases. It could be a resource where patients could be contacted. And in fact, we've done that at Editas Medicine, working with the Foundation Fighting Blindness. They agreed to send out contact letters for one of the studies that we were interested in doing. I should say that Muscular Dystrophy Association has done a similar thing where limb-girdle muscular dystrophy can be caused by more than 30 different genes, and they too are now offering a gene panel free to patients so they can get more specific treatment. Okay. Many rare diseases, natural history is really gleaned from case reports in the literature, small case series, and a lot of the information that we would find in medical records is not really suitable for a clinical trial. And so a lot of companies and with FDA's really encouragement, perform natural history studies before embarking in a clinical trial, because it's hard to know what to look for in a clinical trial if you don't really know what endpoints would be not only meaningful to patients but also measurable. And so, getting patients to agree to participate in a study without treatment that may involve travel to another city and periodic visits, is a big ask. And here again, the patient advocates can help talk to patients about the value of these types of studies. Many of these studies as well, the sponsors, of course, would cover all the costs of the testing and the travel, which the patients may not be aware of. Now, some of the patient organizations have gone so far as to say these natural history studies, if companies are doing them, then it sounds like a good idea, and I think that's another way that patient organizations can empower themselves if they also fund their own studies and perform registries or collect data that eventually could attract the interest of a sponsor to conduct a clinical trial in that particular disease. So, as I mentioned, there isn't oftentimes a lot known about these diseases, and certainly you'd like to do a clinical trial that's showing the value of your drug. And so it's very common practice for sponsors to talk to patients about their disease, about what bothers them the most about it, or even about the treatment they're receiving. We had an example a few years ago where we had an advisory board for a rare disease, acid sphingomyelinase, or even PIC type B disease, where we spent the day talking to patients about their condition, and then there was going to be a dinner at the end of the night, and all 5 people declined, not because they weren't hungry, but they were so exhausted. And we realized that fatigue was really an important part of this condition, and that led to a fatigue questionnaire being included as part of the clinical trial design. We also talked to patients about treatment they're receiving. Certainly with Gaucher disease, back in the 80s, this was a really debilitating disease where most patients were in wheelchairs because of the bone disease that they would incur. And then following enzyme replacement therapy, all of a sudden these people were leading really active, productive lives and having jobs and families, and they really did not have much in the way of disease symptoms. But enzyme replacement therapy requires an infusion every 2 weeks, and that's different than taking a pill, every day. And so, as part of the focus groups that we would have, we'd ask patients, what about your treatment? And they'd say, can you put the enzyme in a pill? I just don't want to keep doing these infusions for 10 years, 15 years. And, initially we thought it was kind of a sarcastic comment, but then we got to thinking about it. And it turned out that there was an approach that could be used that would be an oral treatment called substrate reduction therapy. And that was a program that went on for about 14 years and then eventually resulted in the approval of a oral treatment for Gaucher disease in 2014. So now patients have an option. They can still do the infusions if they want, or if they just want to take a pill twice a day, they can do that as well. We also talked to patients about input into clinical trial designs. One of the first meetings that I had at Editas was an advisory panel to discuss our Leber's congenital amaurosis program. And one of the representatives there was actually from the Foundation Fighting Blindness that could give us some input on the protocol and what seemed feasible and not feasible, how much of a burden would it be to patients. And so they can be very helpful in that regard. You heard earlier today about Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and that's been a very proactive patient series of organizations. The Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, PPMD, recognized years ago that care at different institutions was very uneven. And in 2006, working with the CDC, they put together, I wouldn't call them clinical practice guidelines, but they were clinical care considerations that would help physicians that were taking care of patients with Duchenne have more of a standardized approach to their clinical care. And then later, they put together a checklist of different centers across the U.S. That they called Duchenne Care Centers. There were 12 of them that met criteria for comprehensive care and could conduct clinical trials, so that when sponsors were looking to investigate treatments in this patient population, there would be a network of centers that were already, in a sense, pre-qualified by the patients. And then finally, one other activity they did that was interesting was they went to FDA and they said, you know, there's no specific treatments for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We want there to be a facilitation of the process. When there are treatments available, we want, in a sense, a template of how to do a clinical trial, you know, in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And while I'll say there wasn't a very prescriptive response from the FDA, they did just this past February come out with a guidance document on clinical trial considerations for dystrophinopathies and related disorders that address a lot of the questions that sponsors might have. They're interested in developing treatments for these diseases. So I mentioned how this group approached FDA about how do you design a clinical trial that sponsors would be able to conduct. There's actually another forum that patients have that interact with the FDA, and that's their advisory committee meetings. And these are meetings that the FDA convenes with their expert panel where they have a question about the approvability of a drug, and they want to pose questions about the safety and efficacy and ultimate, you know, put it to a vote whether or not a drug should be approved. And you know, I had the opportunity of presenting at one of these panels back in 2003 for a enzyme replacement therapy for MPS I. And the way the meeting works is that the sponsor gives a presentation for an hour, basically saying why they feel that risk-benefit is favorable. And then the FDA, using the same data, usually reaches a different conclusion, saying why it's not favorable. And then they pose a series of questions to the advisory committee. Well, around midday, they have an hour that's a public forum. And it's a really interesting concept. The whole meeting is public. And patients, relatives, physicians, advocates, anyone can come and speak. And the rule is that you can't speak for more than 5 minutes. So they make sure that they get enough participation during that hour. And during the time that was the public forum, we heard patients with MPS I, patients develop joint contractures that make it difficult for them to perform activities of daily living and walk. And we heard testimonials from patients about how kids now could walk to their friends' houses a few blocks away. And this one patient who wasn't in the clinical trial, but would have what would be considered an attenuated form of MPS I, so later onset, so-called mild form, had talked to the committee and told them about how she'd undergone both open heart surgery as well as spine surgery because of her condition. And so how can people consider this disease mild? And so it really, I think, struck home and brought the patient voice to the committee, that it wasn't just, you know, statistics and numbers that they were evaluating. It was really how, you know, people's lives would be impacted by these drugs. Now, in April of 2016, there was probably the largest and most contentious advisory committee meeting ever held, and that was for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. You heard about the eteplirsen story earlier today, and what was really interesting about that was that you know, the FDA had questions about the approvability. The committee actually voted against the approval of the drug. And during the public session, instead of 1 hour, they had to extend it to 3 hours because so many patients and advocates showed up. You know, I think they had over 52 presentations that the committee listened to. They still voted against it. But the director of CEDAR, Janet Woodcock, looked at the data and actually overruled the advisory committee and her own review team, and granted an accelerated approval. Again, you heard earlier, on the basis of increases in dystrophin and skeletal muscle biopsies that she felt could reasonably predict clinical benefit. And certainly with accelerated approvals, it's not the end of the story. Sponsors still have to do a confirmatory clinical study, but it did provide a way of access of a drug to patients who otherwise have a fatal disease. And it's been really, I think, a pretty controversial decision since then. A lot of people feel like the decision was very strongly influenced by patients, but again, it really comes down to the interpretation of the accelerated approval process and what we're trying to do in terms of giving access to patients. Now, market access is a term we use to describe patients actually receiving drug. And in a perfect world, the sponsor makes the drug, the patient is identified, the physician writes a prescription, and the patient gets the drug. Well, what happens when there's no drug? Well, this happened to Genzyme in 2009 when a virus infection took down the manufacturing plant. And there were two drugs that were being developed at the time, enzyme replacement therapies for Gaucher and Gaucher and Fabry disease that resulted in a drug shortage. So patients went without treatment for a period of time, where they underwent dose reductions. And this was all done in conjunction with expert physicians who really determined what the need was across patients and how best to ration the drug. Patients and patient advocates were brought into the process pretty early. There were town halls that were held between senior leadership at Genzyme and patients to keep them updated on the status of what was going on. And there were a lot of town halls. The shortage went on for 3 years. And so it really was a very bad situation for patients. Could have been a lot worse if they weren't involved with part of the process. And I think it was really a testament to the senior leadership that they maintain this transparency and maintain the trust with patients. And finally, just to touch on legislation, this is another area that patient groups have been very active in, not only individual patient disease foundations, but also umbrella organizations like NORD, the National Organization of Rare Diseases, the Every Life Foundation, that really have groups of different diseases under their purview. And they have worked tirelessly with Congress to enact legislation that would really help expedite drug development for rare diseases. And probably many of you have heard of the 21st Century Cures Act that was signed into legislation December 2016. And there's two really interesting provisions in there that relate to the patient voice. One of them mandates that FDA must summarize information they receive from patients about their use of the drug. And so patient experiences have to be documented, and as part of the review process, they have to be summarized by the FDA. And this is to ensure that they're hearing the voice of the patient. Another provision is the use of real-world evidence, which I think is a foreign concept to most people when it comes to clinical trials, and it really refers to any evidence outside of randomized controlled trials. So open-label studies, observational studies, disease registries, either through patient foundations or sponsored by companies, or even insurance claims. These all qualify as real-world evidence. And so FDA will be taking these into account more than they had in the past, where really the reliance was just on randomized controlled trials. So what I hope I've been able to describe today is that there are several levels that sponsors can interact with patient organizations, where the patient organizations can really help enable both the diagnosis of patients as well as their access to precision medicines. And their reach isn't just among patients or physicians, but now really has extended both to the regulators, the FDA, as well as the policymakers in Congress. So, thank you.
So thank you, Jerry. While the audience comes up with any questions, I have a few for you. So first one is, I hear you saying that the diaries, the patient diaries for the life history is important to get regulatory buy-in, that the FDA has encouraged for these small populations where we don't know the life history, the life trajectory of these patients, we should get that. The part that confuses me, or maybe I'm not confused, is that it may take several years for these life histories to be acquired. Does that mean that if I'm in this rare disease bucket, before we can start a therapy, I have to wait to gain a couple of, 3 or 4 years to get meaningful curve on that life history?
No, I think, certainly the FDA will receive data, with or without treatment on patients. They're interested in understanding the burden of illness and the experiences that patients have had. Some treatments, may have effects that occur within a few months or a few years. I know with the Duchenne trial, that was a relatively short trial where the endpoints really, I think, did not differentiate any clinical benefit with treatment, but anecdotally now, over the long term, it appears that there is a high percentage of boys that are continuing to walk who've received treatment that otherwise you'd expect would not still be walking.
All right. I was going to have more questions, and I do have more questions, but I'm going to do it in my dictatorial way. I'm going to make another executive decision. I'm going to give priority to people who have not asked questions yet. So 2 people over there have priority. Sorry, guys on the left wing.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay from the?
Yes.
Okay, great. My name is Angela Lamb. I'm from Precision Medicine at Novartis. My question is, given the challenges of the sample collection from rare disease patient population to run clinical trials, can you explain to me how Editas, or in your experience at Genzyme, how they've worked with FDA to make approvals less stringent and to make treatments more available to these patient populations?
I think the question was about patient sample collection.
Yeah, due to the rarity of these, these rare diseases, it'll be more difficult to collect these patient samples to run clinical trials.
So is the question about the number of the patients or getting the samples from them?
The question is really, how have you worked with FDA to convince them that you don't need these big clinical trials? And
sample size.
It's more maybe a less statistical stringency to convince them that besides, this is a real world problem, how can we expedite these approvals?
Right, so I think the question has to do with running a clinical trial that's going to look for an effect on a clinical endpoint, which might require a lot more patients compared to, say, a biomarker or a surrogate endpoint that would allow much smaller patient populations. With the 21st Century Cures Act, there is more of a push towards validating biomarkers for rare diseases and implementing that. There's very few biomarkers that have been approved as surrogates in rare diseases. Phenylalanine levels, for PKU would be one. For Fabry disease, we had developed a novel pathologic biopsy endpoint from kidneys that the FDA accepted as a surrogate endpoint. But, what you need to demonstrate is that the biomarker of interest is in the causal pathway of the disease, and that it's predictive of clinical benefit. The FDA tells us, they're not against these types of endpoints. Certainly, if there's a clinical endpoint that's feasible, they would prefer that because that's a direct measure of clinical benefit. But if you can make the justification that a particular biomarker meets all the validation criteria, that you can measure it accurately, it's prognostic, and it correlates with disease severity and responsive to change, then I think they'd be willing to look at it.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Zach. Jim Cimino from University of Alabama, Birmingham. This has been a great meeting. I've learned a lot today, but I'm a country doc from Alabama. And I need to know, I'm hoping to get some insight. No, it's partly true. I'm hoping to get some insight into the delivery of precision medicine, the last 3 feet. That is, from the computer to the examining table, the computer to the bedside. I was hoping to hear some about today, and I didn't. So you're a clinician, and you're doing this stuff. So I'm wondering, what kind of infrastructure can we put in place so that as we learn more, as we bring in genetic data that is variants of unknown significance today, because tomorrow they may be of known significance, how do we put in place an architecture that lets us bring the data to the clinicians, to the patients, so that as we learn more knowledge, we can deliver important information at the time that it's needed? You know, we do these tests now, the All of Us project nationwide. In Alabama, we have the Alabama Genome Health Initiative, and we're giving docs and patients their genetic data, and 7 years from now, we're telling them now, if you ever get anesthesia, make sure you don't do this. And then 7 years from now, they go and get anesthesia. How are we going to, do you have any insights on how we organize this stuff so we can deliver it in a coherent way and not a one-off kind of thing? Sorry.
Big question.
That's a long question.
Are you sure you're a country doc?
I'm working on my accent.
Yeah, so, you make a lot of good points. The system is fragmented. Certainly electronic health records will help unite, the different visits that patients have and the information they present. With the precision medicines, it really does start with a diagnosis and pairing up the specific diagnosis with the type of medicine that's being used. In some cases, you might need to know the exact mutation, and some mutations might be amenable to the treatment and some not. Certainly, physicians talking to the patients about the risk-benefit of these treatments is going to be really important. I think what people, they understand, but then they forget that these are, in some cases, permanent treatments. A gene therapy, if you're doing a subretinal delivery to the retina, to the eye, you can't take that back once it goes in. So, having patients really be informed that, this is, potentially going to be beneficial, but, it can't be reversed as well. I know for the gene therapy for the Leber's congenital amaurosis, there are a number of centers that have been set up throughout the U.S. that have expertise in administering the gene therapy to the subretinal space, and that's part of the way that the FDA, in a sense, has ensured that there's some standards in the way that some of these treatments are being delivered. So I think there will be some specialized centers depending on the therapeutic modality, and if it involves, delicate surgery, like retinal surgery, there'll be a few centers that'll be doing that.
So again, I'm going to pull an executive decision. Jim, I think you're right. I don't think we addressed the issue of what's that last mile infrastructure. And so there at least will be a panel about that next year. And so I just want to take the opportunity, first of all, to thank our closing keynote speaker, Jerry, again. And I hope you will join me in thanking the person who did the most to organize this meeting, Ms. Samantha Lemos. Thank you very much, Samantha. See you in a year.